Okay, now that you understand the architecture of the muscle, we're going to start to looking at how this thing can actually contracts. So in this section, I want you to recognize three things. One is that the sarcomere is going to be the functional unit of this muscle. That's going to be the contracting part of the muscle. We're going to look at all the components of that sarcomere and then understand how these components, especially the myofilaments, slide on each other, and we call that the sliding filament model. All right, so just a quick review. This is our muscle fiber, and remember the muscle fiber is equal to the cell. That cell is surrounded by that sarcolemma, and inside we're going to have all of these little myofibrils, and coming out of the myofibrils are these microfilaments. We're also going to have many nuclei in this cell fiber. You can see a couple of them down here. When you look at the fiber, we say it has striations to it, meaning we've got all these different stripes. These stripes are going to be made of thick and thin filaments. So if we just look at it here, these dark ones are going to be thick. I'll do a couple dark ones here, and then these lighter ones in between them are going to be thin filaments. And we're going to have some medium filaments as well. And in the middle of these thin filaments, I'm going to talk about it on the next slide, but you're going to see this really thin line here. This thin line we're going to call the Z disc. I'm just pointing it out here because this is probably the best picture that we have of that Z disc. Okay, so we can take this as an actual picture of the myofibrils, looking at it inside that cell. And so we have all these striations, and here you can see the dark striations, and we're going to call this the A band. That A band is basically going to be wherever we have myosin. That's not coming in so good, so let me erase that and do it in a darker color. I'll draw it in here. Here we go. Myosin is going to be these dark green bands. And myosin fibers actually look kind of like this. They have a big long tail and then a little head on them. And so this will be a myosin fiber. And the way that you see it arranged here is that there's actually two myosin fibers going out to different sides. This will be another myosin fiber. So you're seeing those guys right in here, and their little heads popping up. So these are going to make up our thick filaments. And then we've got our thin filaments, which is going to be our actin. And the actin is right up here. You can see that they're kind of making little bridges over the thick filaments. So these thin filaments are called actin. So when we're looking at these bands, this dark A band is purely myosin. I mean, it's where the myosin is, not just pure myosin, but that A band is made up of the myosin. Where we don't have myosin, that's going to be making up the I band. So you're going to see that's going to be actin and part of this Z disc line. The Z disc line, just so you can see it a little more clearly, is this kind of a zipper line here that's attaching all of the actin together. So you can see how the actin is attached to this Z disc right at this point here and here. What you're not seeing on this slide is how the myosin is attached. It's not just floating out there in space. That myosin is actually attached to that Z disc as well. And you'll see this in the next slide through this protein called titin. I'll write this in here. This is going to be titin. And that titin is going to secure that myosin down in place. So we've got the I bands that are no myosin. We've got the A bands that are made up of myosin. And we've got the Z discs kind of being bookshelves, or the bookends, of this actin, these thin and thick filaments. And between the two Z discs, this is going to be our sarcomere. So the sarcomere runs from Z disc to Z disc. And this is going to be the contractile unit of the muscle. That's the sarcomere, is the contractile part. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We'll add a couple more things on here. This is the same picture, and it's drawn in 2D. What I want you to recognize from this is that really these fibers are running in 3 dimensions. So it's really a big cylinder. And you're going to have this actin and myosin being surrounded, all these little tubes surrounding each other, making this big, long, thick myofilament. You can just see another picture of, here's the Z discs out here, here's the A band in here, okay? And we're going to start to differentiate some of this stuff a little bit. So here we go with our A band. So the A band is running from the end of the myosin to the end of the myosin. It's completing everywhere where the myosin is, that's where we've got this A band. Then we're going to have, let me keep going on here, the I band is going to be all the spaces where the myosin is not. So we're only going to have the thin filaments and this Z disc here. Again, here's that Z disc coming right down the middle. So the I band has no myosin with it. And it's going to go basically from myosin to myosin. So it's going to span between 2 different sarcomeres. The H band or zone, well, if we look at the A band where it's all myosin, you're going to see part of it is going to have actin on it, this part right here. On either end of it's going to have actin on it. And then there's going to be a place in the middle where there is no actin. And that place in the middle where there is no actin, we're going to call that the H band. So the H band is this open space in here. And what you're going to see happen on this next slide, and I'll kind of draw it on this one a little bit, is we're going to have heads. Remember that myosin has little heads that reach up here. They're going to reach up and they're going to be trying to pull on that actin. They're going in 3 dimensions here, so I'll kind of go down this way too. I just can't draw it as well on the next slide because it's too small. So when they contract, they're going to pull these actin fibers in towards the middle. So what's going to end up happening, you're going to see on the next slide, is that H band is going to shrink as those actin filaments are pulled into the middle. So let's take a look at that. And as they get pulled into the middle, they're pulling on the Z band. So that Z band is going to come in towards the middle as well. But what's kind of hard to see is that that's happening on both sides of the Z band. So this one's going to be going into its middle, and you're going to see that this whole thing is going to shrink down. So here's that one sarcomere. We're just blowing it up a little bit bigger. You can see these little heads of the myosin, how they're reaching up here towards the actin. And remember how I told you in the beginning that these are really just big long tails with little heads coming off of them. Well, you're going to have that on both sides. And where those tails join together, we're going to call that the M line. So the M line lives right in the middle of this H band and the A band. Okay, and here you can finally see those titin filaments that are binding on to the myosin to hold that to the Z disc as well. So everything's nice and secure. You can see the thin filament, which is our actin. Okay, and our thick filament, which is our myosin. So I'm hoping this is kind of building in on each other, so you can see how this whole thing is going to contract. When those myosin heads pull on the actin, they're going to pull it into the middle, causing these Z discs to go into the middle. And we'll see that happening. That's going to make this H band shrink, and it's also going to make this I band shrink. So that's what we're seeing here. Now we've got 2 sarcomeres together, and you can see that as this H band shrinks, It's coming together more and more. It's getting smaller and smaller. But what's really interesting is that the myosin, so that's this structure right here, it doesn't change in its size. All that it's doing is it's pulling those actin filaments closer together. So the A band is always going to stay the same length. But the H band and the I band, those are the things that shorten as the sarcomere comes together and contracts. Okay, so let's put the whole thing together that we've talked about for the last two sections. You've got a muscle fiber. It's going to attach to the bones. It's going to pull the insertion up towards, the origin. It's going to do that because we've got these myofibrils that are shortening and coming together. They're pulling the Z discs together, causing that sarcomere to shorten. We call this a sliding filament theory because you've got this actin sliding on the myosin, and it's going to pull it together. And in this next section, we're going to go over how those myosin heads grip onto the actin and then pull it in towards that middle of that M line. A bands always stay the same length, but the H bands and the I bands are going to shorten up as those actin filaments are pulled closer together. And that ends this section. So in the next section, we'll talk about how these heads actually bind and let go and go through this whole cycle.